Welcome to the Freedom Fridays podcast. With me, your host, Pete Clark, the Whispers guy. Work seems to expand to the time that we give it. And I've been investing my time, occasionally on a Friday, to explore how we use our time, our energy, our attention, and the impact it has on our identity. I've been exploring over season 1 some of the mindset shifts in the handcuffs of I have to the freedom of I choose to. And I've shared some conversations, some tips, some tools about how you might want to invest your own time, your own energy, your own attention. How you might want to, if you choose to, make some changes to your identity. How you might have freedom from I have to and design a life around I choose to. If that's of interest to you, then this is the podcast for you. In season 2, I'm going to be exploring some experts and asking them what freedom means for them. And trying to help people work to live and not live to work. Trying to help people add life to their years and not just years to their life. So let's dive on in, and here's season 2. Welcome everyone to the latest episode of Freedom Fridays. So my guest today is, according to his website, he's a Scot with an Irish name and an English accent who's an Aussie. And so I'm a Scot with a Scottish name with an English family who's got an Aussie passport. So welcome to the show, Conor O'Malley.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Pete. A kindred spirit, I fear, that we're having a conversation with today. And thank you for the opportunity. And I hope what we share is of interest to your listeners.
You're welcome, Conor. And, we had a conversation prior to the recording, and there are quite a few connections that we've got, given our backgrounds. And so we may get into that space in the conversation. But as I said, Conor, I start these with the same question. Freedom Fridays. In the line of work that you do, what does freedom mean?
Great question. What a good one to start with. Freedom for me in this context is in two domains, Pete. Mm-hmm. One is, I'll say, an internal freedom is how do we free ourselves to potentially do our best work? How do we free ourselves to be our best self? How do we free ourselves to be the best person and partner, father, husband, the friend that we can be? So there's an internal freedom, which then potentially gives us an external freedom, which is the way in which we do things. And, you mentioned, look in my profile, and you'll know that I bring this distinction to the world, again, through my learning and standing on the shoulders of others and my learning, of our way of being and our way of doing. And as soon as I heard the notion of, freedom, it brings that distinction of being and doing.
Okay, thank you. I'm already assuming this could go on for quite a while. This is both in our sweet spots here. Let me start by, when did you come to this conclusion?
Very good question. When did I first learn about the notion of way of being?
Yep.
Which I know is not I'm not trying to do that now. The question you meant to ask, Pete, was, I will answer your question. But I feel it needs a wee bit of context, which is in 2017, I left the executive world of corporate leadership, essentially in the supply chain, to move into the world of coaching. And through that, I came across a particular philosophy of coaching, of which was around our way of being. And there's a core learning that I kind of was privileged to learn through. But in answer to your question, I now make a slightly different distinction myself through my experience of not only that learning journey, but also my coaching and my life journey now, between way of being and way of doing. So when did I actually make this distinction? Maybe 12 months ago, after I wrote my book. But even in my book, it still is I'll say, more of the theoretical distinction of this philosophy of coaching called ontology. And I would say now, which is why I guess I'm doing my second edition of the book, because I feel it needs tweaking to now my distinction of what is way of being and way of doing, which is internal freedom and external freedom, using the language of earlier on. So maybe a year.
Okay, cool. I'm going to guess, though, that that philosophy or that conclusion has been whispering to you for years.
What's the distinction of years? I would certainly say not up to 5 years ago,
Okay.
because we talk about stories. So an argument of an internal freedom in our way of being is freeing ourselves in our internal language from the stories that we've lived with. So for me, that would be an internal freedom, is freeing ourselves from our previously held stories. Now, first of all, we've got to recognize them. I would use the word observe. Yep. And then we've got to choose to shift our narrative, which I believe we can. I believe strongly that you can choose to re-narrate your stories. And my story, as I mentioned earlier on to you, was up to 5 years ago, unless, I'm the CEO of a, many multi-million, if not a multi-billion FMCG, third-party logistics business, maybe a wholesaler, that I in my career am not a success. It was very binary. And I thought through that success would come, the way that you could support your family and so many other things. Driven by ego, yeah, in part, for sure. Not proud of saying that, but I can now recognize that that was a story that I was living with all the way through school life, through university, and so on and so forth. Let's say had to be the captain, the leader. That no longer is the story I carry, and I'm absolutely reconciled and at peace with that, which I would say has given me a personal freedom to do what I do and provide a different way of doing, coming from that internal freedom of letting go of that story.
Conor, my experience of, and I'd be the same in many ways, but different ways, of falling for the ego traps. So let's accept that many people fall into. What I'm interested in, I don't know if you've had any thoughts about this. Usually our ego is masking an unmet need. And I'm wondering if you've reflected in being the captain of the rugby team, the football team, the multi-million-dollar industry, blah, 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 blah. Do you recognize now what need in you was unmet?
Great question. Another way of looking at that is a concern. So a concern that we need to take care of, or as you say, an unmet need. Difficult to answer specifically with one thing. I think the concern that I had to take care of, or the unmet need, was, which doesn't feel like it's the answer to the question, but it feels like the answer to the question, is being the leader and always having to be the leader. Now, for me, here we go. Okay. I think a distinction that's emerging for me, even in this conversation, and this might be a revelation in itself for me, if therefore not for anybody else, is a capital L versus small l.
Yep.
So for me, leader was capital L, leader of people, leader of others, which therefore meant that you were kind of at the arrowhead, if you like, which certainly leadership is changing. So that's no longer necessary, that you have to be kind of at the arrowhead of leadership to be a leader with a capital L.
Yep.
As opposed to, there is a notion of a thought leader, for example, or you might say that you can be a leader of your profession without necessarily being a leader of others. So I think the story I would have been carrying, and what I had to let go of, was that leadership is simply leading others, leading a team, leading a business, being the captain, and it comes in many, many other forms now.
You certainly, we both talked about our kind of love of sport, and you see in sport certainly many, many different forms of captains, people that lead the team, very different. And I certainly see that in organizations now, and I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but you certainly see different Some I would say aren't equipped for it necessarily because they've gotten the job because they're good at the job their subordinates do. You know, the best salesperson gets the sales manager's job and you lose two good people.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your experience of that is. If we maybe jump into corporate for a second, I'm going to move around a little bit. You said leadership is changing.
Yeah.
What's it changing from to and why?
Thank you. I'll start by saying now my definition of what is a leader is a person who others choose to follow. Now, I know that I've read that somewhere and I've heard that on a, heard that. So I can't remember where I heard it, but that really resonates with me. So this notion of capital L, small l, it's with a small l, and a leader is a person who others choose to follow. In other words, putting in their discretionary effort, or that person takes care of their unmet needs or their concerns, and therefore they choose to follow that person. So that's my definition, if you like, of what is or who is a leader or what a leader is. Leadership is changing, in my view, in a couple of core ways. At the C-suite level, I think leadership is changing where leaders have now to be more leaders in society than solely of their business.
Right.
And that actually comes to the notion of trust, because trust in the classic institutions of state, of media, of church, ironically, even not-for-profits, is lessening. And that specifically comes from the Edelman Trust Barometer, 2020, 21, 22, for the last 3 years and more, but certainly the last 3 years, each year, that there is an expectation that leaders of business are more trusted than other areas. And therefore, I'm drawing the conclusion, as they do, that those leaders need to be more leaders in society than was previously the case, because there's not trust in the other typical or classic, I should say, institutions that were. And I think that in itself heightens the importance of leaders being more self-aware, having a greater understanding of purpose and where they stand on certain issues, because they will be expected to speak about those particular issues. So they'd better have a position. And I think that comes from within, that comes from their being, that comes from their narratives, their values, and so on and so forth. So that's one area it's changing. And the other area it's changing for me is the how of leadership. More empathy, more curiosity, more co-creation. Here's a question I believe leaders now need to be able to ask, is not only, so Pete, what do you think? They now need to ask, Pete, how are you feeling? It's a completely different question. And they also have to have the competency to respond to the person who answers the question, how they're feeling, as opposed to what do you think?
Yeah.
So, and who's looking for that? I think, millennials are certainly looking more for, or they're not looking for the ego-fueled my way or the highway style leadership. That is the leadership to a degree I was brought up in, especially in trucks and sheds and distribution centers and unions. So there's still importance of decision making. There's still importance of creating a vision. There's still importance of alignment, but not the ego fueled my way or the highway. This is the way we're going to do it. And then, two other areas. Thank God for this. There are more women who, in my view, are becoming more and more empowered in leadership in general in business, and certainly more women in the C-suite. Not enough, but certainly, we want more, or I certainly want more, and I believe the world and business wants more. And then there are also, the minority groups, without going into all of them, who should have and need their voice to be heard. Now that takes a different style of leadership in terms of empathy, in terms of listening, in terms of curiosity, in terms of co-creation. That was not the case certainly 10, but certainly 20 years ago, but even 5 years ago, it's changing. And then if we bring in COVID and the notion of trust and working from home and what is culture, it's changing. And then if you bring the last one in, you might say, with regards to the amount of information that is being piled on leaders. I mean, that's a metaphor almost, or an image, piled on leaders. They've got to cut through it. And I love the question with or that Karen in one of your previous podcasts raised, and said, and I forget who she said it about, or who said it, is the currency of knowledge is not what I know, but it's, you know, it's around the currency of being able to ask the questions. And I think that is so true. So there's how leadership is changing. And I hope that the work that I do serves those leaders, shift elements of their way of being to support them being more effective in their way of doing as a leader.
Yeah. I've often said, with, again, sometimes I feel like I have to be careful with certain clients because I'm trying to meet them where they're at.
Yes.
And if I find the right space, I would often say things like we've over glamorized knowledge and diluted connection.
Nice.
So by me knowing more and me telling you more and sharing it, you know, I disconnect from actually what's going on with you. Hence why I kind of circle back to my question about unmet needs. I think COVID has piled on people even more unmet needs, as in so many people aren't seen, aren't heard, aren't held just for who they are, let alone what they could be. And I think that's creating all sorts of issues separately. That's probably another podcast, Conor.
Indeed.
I'm going to play contrarian if you don't mind, just for the purpose of the conversation. And I actually quite like your simple but not simplistic definition of leader, as in someone you choose to follow. So how does that reconcile with TikTok influencers? Because there's many millions of people choose to follow those. Are they leaders? And if they are, why? And if they aren't, why? Because I love the simplicity of choose to follow. Or would you
I would say they are leaders. Now, whether we want to acknowledge that they're leaders, given our distinction of what we might see as a leader in a particular realm, but I would say that the person who is the kind of U-Butte kind of TikTok kind of dancer or whatever they do, are they a leader? Yeah, I'm comfortable. Small L. So again, this distinction, you know, even in my own head, my own language of large L, small L, but you know, I think I'm quite comfortable. Now, am I comfortable in what they're leading? Maybe not, but that's our judgment, right? That's our judgment, our assessment that that's not a thing of value that you're leading. I may or may not feel that.
Yeah.
But is that to say they're not a leader? No, I don't think it is.
And it's a slightly off tangent, off piece comment that kind of backs up what I think we're both saying here. Is I was listening this morning to a podcast. I don't know if you know Sam Harris.
No.
He's a US neuroscientist. He's got Waking Up is his app, and he does podcasts. He does a kind of show with Ricky Gervais, and you know he's pretty well known. Right. One of his mates is Joe Rogan,
right,
who, as you may know, has the biggest podcast on the planet.
Right.
And I was listening to Sam Harris's podcast about the apology that Joe Rogan had to make, or felt he had to make, about a couple of things, using the N-word 10 years ago in some of his comments. And the interesting thing I felt that Sam Harris was saying was Joe Rogan's only recently become fully aware of the impact that he has. He has more reach than any of the news agencies combined.
Indeed.
Now, what was interesting, he said he kind of gets away with it because I'm just a comic. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. So I'm just going to say, and more laterally, what I'm hearing Sam Harris saying, given his reach, given his multi-million people following him, he might have to tighten the reins or tighten the spread of his opinions based on, you know, we know the power of words. All it takes is it's not a race. And suddenly you have an impact on society. And so I do wonder if those that do have followers, whether it's corporate or TikTok or Joe Rogan, really fully understand the impact of a phrase, a word, a full stop.
I agree. And what's resonating for me is a couple of things here, Pete, if I may. One is rightly or wrongly, but in my listening, it confirms that they are leaders of and in society. And therefore, there's a responsibility that comes with that, that they at least need to acknowledge, and then they can have a choice as to what they want to do with that. So that's the first thing. So is leadership changing people more leaders in society than before? That kind of proves that thesis for me in my listening. Mm-hmm. And the other one is the notion of allyship, which I don't know if you've done any work or in that.
I've heard the phrase.
So at a headline level, the notion of allyship can come in different domains. So for me, I have been told that I am a ally for women in leadership, given the work that I do in the space of mentoring women leaders, especially in the supply chain space.
Yep.
And my understanding of that is you cannot call yourself an ally. It needs to be conferred on you. That's the first thing.
Okay.
And it's conferred on you because those people of whom you may wish to try to be an ally for or of, that only they can determine whether you are or not. And the other core element of being an ally, and this is what really resonated for me when you were sharing your story there about the podcast, is a recognition of one's own place relative to those who see you an ally. Now, I know I had a privileged upbringing. Very, I'll say posh English boarding school, parents living around the world, home up in the Highlands of Scotland, absolutely a privileged background. Mm. What I now realize is that it was even more privileged than I realized it was relative to so many others. So my lens of what privilege was has massively expanded. And now I believe, and I hope I can say this appropriately for those listening, that as a white middle-aged bloke, that in itself gives one privilege in today's society. Then add on that, tertiary education, then add on kind of posh private school, then add on kind of a life as an expat child living in the Highlands of Scotland. It's layer on layer on layer of privilege. Now, I didn't see that. So now I can appreciate far more that there's a place that others will see me that I never saw myself. I'm only now starting to see that. So that, in my reading of allyship, are the two core areas that are critical. Then it goes into being a learner. So then it really is around understanding and having an empathy and being a learner of those who see you as an ally. Anyway, that's where your story of the podcast and that those two individuals took me to.
Can you just explain that a bit, Colin? What is being a learner of those you are allyship with? I can't remember the phrase.
Or an ally to, an ally with.
What does that mean? How do you
understanding their stories? So at a headline level, it means understanding your stories. There's in the coaching practice, the philosophy of ontological coaching that I bring to the world, and it's actually one of my hashtags is #legitimate other. So there's this notion of how do I hold the other person who I'm in a conversation with, you and I now, in a relationship with, kind of big R, small r, relative to the extent of that relationship. How do I hold you as the legitimate other? And at its headline level, for me, that means understanding your story as best as I can, listening to where you're coming from, being curious and asking questions. Now, I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to agree with your assessments or your views, but I have a responsibility to hear you. And this is where I've just heard, you might have heard of the word Ubuntu So I hear you, I see you.
Yep.
That is fundamental, as I understand it, to somebody seeing you as an ally.
And I find, Conor, that part of my messaging to the leaders I work with is often Ubuntu is enough.
Yeah.
It's often because it's the biggest thing missing. Absolutely. No one hears me, no one sees me, no one holds me. So just someone else, another human doing that in a purely authentic and genuine and real way is like, whoa, I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about that.
Yeah, likewise. And then maybe you talk about language and the importance of language. which is then is how do we as leaders and as humans, but in this context, leaders, give the space through our language for those to be heard, for those to be seen. And arguably a way that we do this is by being very purposeful with a type of conversation that we have with other individuals and the type of conversation that we create for others to have. And again, there's a topic in itself in the notion of, you know, of types of conversations, and how arguably, I'll make a statement here, that every conversation that we have can be labeled as a particular type of conversation, every conversation. And it's being purposeful on knowing that.
In the work I've done over the years, I'm a firm believer that every relationship succeeds slowly or quickly. And so, you know, you and I have just connected for the first time.
Yeah.
You know, we've had a few exchanges over email. We've connected at least on Zoom. And, you know, if we made up face to face, that relationship will continue slowly until it gets faster. Whereas we might kind of go, nah, Pete, I'm not so sure about him. I don't like the way he organized his books and blah, 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 blah. And it might just dissipate for whatever reason.
Indeed.
And I wonder how often that happens in corporate beyond, and I'm tagging something else on here, beyond the hierarchy. Most of the organizations I work with are still to this day, which I believe in a little bit of reading I've done, you know, the boxes and lines, here's the org chart. That's 100-year-old philosophy.
Yeah.
And yet we still use it.
Indeed.
Because we haven't found a different or better way to signify, visualize, what does the organization look like? So let's go to the old boxes and wires, boxes and lines. And so there's some hierarchical aspect. Oh, I report to Conor, so therefore I can't do this and I have to do that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how often do you see that show up? And are there any antidotes to it?
Well, there'd be those listening who would argue the antidote is agile working and scrums and, you know, different structures there. And I'm going to say I have not worked in that space where I can actually say it is an antidote or not. However, my sense is that it's simply another structure which creates some of the same challenges that we're referring to. But I acknowledge that it may well be an antidote, and it certainly is emerging as a potentially different way to the hierarchical structure. So that having been said, if we go, again, I'm going to go to this distinction of way of being, way of doing. I firmly believe that language, the audible language that we use, is a way of doing. So I do not subscribe to action speaks louder than words per se. Okay, I would have done, I get it, and I even get the notion of it, but I actually choose not to subscribe to that. Why? Because used effectively, language is action. So in part for me, it is how we as leaders are aware of the language that we use, you know, that we hear in our own way of being, in our own inner listening, and then how do we construct the environment, bit of repetition here, apologize, how do we construct the environment such that facilitates us having purposeful conversations? That, you know, I feel as drifting maybe into the domain of psychological safety, and again, Ubuntu, people being heard, you know, that they can share in a safe environment what it is that they're thinking. That then leads to seeing possibilities. So again, you know, how is leadership changing? It is being open to more possibilities. It is allowing the space for those possibilities to emerge. Again, I know I've used it at least twice, maybe this is a third time, and co-create outcomes. But then some of the old kind of good stuff kicks in, right? Okay, have we got a decision? Yeah, we do. You know, are we going to deliver on this? How are we going to deliver on it? What's the KPIs? What's the objectives? What's the milestones? None of that changes. You know, that doesn't change. We still need to get stuff done, kind of have that paradigm of you know, gosh, what was the, you know, a RACI model, if one of nothing else, in project management of the 1980s. I mean, it still works, but how we get there is now different.
Could you explain, if possible, I know people listening will think they might understand, and some will and some won't, the distinction between being and doing. And you said at the start, freedom from, internal freedom from how you were being, and leads to external freedom to what you can now do. So, paraphrased. What's the difference between being and doing?
So I'd ask yourself and the listeners to think of two Venn diagrams. The best way I can describe it, two Venn diagrams. Way of being. The first circle is our language in our own head. So what are we saying to ourselves? What are our stories? What is our internal narrative, our internal dialogue? Mm-hmm. The second circle is our moods and emotions. Or as Dan Newby says, the energy that moves us, an amazing person who works in emotional literacy and emotional awareness. Mm-hmm. I do not use the word emotional intelligence. I feel that's kind of not
almost like an oxymoron.
Yes, I agree. So way of being, the language in our head, the stories we tell ourselves, our moods and emotions, what we feel. And then the third circle is in the domain of somatics and body, and the way I make that distinction is what we sense and what we notice. Mm-hmm. We don't try and put a label to it. It could literally be shoulder, nose, toenail, ear, forehead, eyebrow, mm-hmm. heart, tummy, knee. That's sense, notice. So those are the three domains of our way of being. Mm-hmm. The way I describe way of doing is, I'll start again with language, the audible language that others hear, how we make meaning through language for others in a purposeful way. That to me is a doing. The other circle in the Venn diagram of doing is our behaviors, mm-hmm. how we behave. That is manifestly evident to others around us. So it is what they see, and to a degree what they might feel, is our behavior. And then the third circle is the action that we take, which covers everything else really in the domain yeah. in the domain of doing.
Yeah.
So hopefully that makes sense. Two Venn diagrams.
Yep.
Inner language, moods, emotions, physiology in being, audible language, behavior, and action taking in doing.
Now I know I'm going to guess that you're faced with the same questions. Most people, I think, would then ask, well, how? Mm. And I'm not sure it's necessarily the best question. However, it will get asked. How do you make that switch? Do you have to do all three to change all three? Do you have to do, is one trump the other? Can you maybe explain if someone comes to the same conclusion that you do and go, oh, hang on, time for a pivot. Yep. I need to change my way of being so I can change my way of doing. Where do you start?
Well, I wouldn't use change is a strong word. So a word that might suit or sit more with the listeners is shift. Shift and change, they could be the same, but in my listening, shift is more subtle. Change is maybe an outcome of multiple shifts. So mm-hmm. that's one element. Mm-hmm. And my answer to the how is actually I will say, life and my coaching philosophy and framework for my coaching, which are these three words: observe,
yep,
choose, act. So first of all, I must observe my way of being. What's way of being? Okay, I can observe my stories. I can observe my energy, my moods, my emotions, and I can observe my physiology. So that's observe internally. And then I also must observe the external environment within which I am living and or leading. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that our external observation comes from within. So it's an inside out observation, not an outside in. So by observing self and being a different observer of self, we can see the world differently. So that's what I mean by observe. Mm-hmm. If in some way of self-observation and or observation of the world in which we're living / leading in, and we make some shifts. So for example, in the domain of our moods, we shift from a below the line to above the line. Let's say from a mood of anxiety, and we shift to a mood of curiosity. Is that possible? I believe it is possible. Mm-hmm. That means that we will probably be more open to possibilities. We will be more effective in dealing with uncertainty. We'll be more open to knowing as opposed to not knowing. So that will open us to more possibilities. which is the notion of choice. We're still going to have to choose some. We can't choose all the possibilities. We're going to have to make some choice. Okay, great. And then if we've made our choices, all right, what action am I going to take? And that's both in the domain of what and how. So what action am I going to take? And how am I going to do it? And the how comes in your behavior and comes in the how you use language. Hence, observe, choose, act is my life and coaching framework.
Lovely. I can see in that definition, Conor, that it's, maybe this is our challenge as executive coaches. I can see it's very obvious to me that someone needs someone alongside them to help them, remind them, cajole them, push them, pull them, cuddle them, hold them, whatever adjective you like. And yet people don't. Any thoughts on why?
Because it's tough. It's bloody tough.
It's
tough to open yourself up to that, because a couple of words I didn't hear, and I know that you do this also, but would be challenge. So executive coaching, the person who is the coach will and should challenge respectfully, hashtag the legitimate other, but at the same stage asking really searching questions as to the narrative the person's hearing in their head, or what they're feeling, or what's happening within their somatic and their body. So it's hard is one response. And here's the other response, which comes from a place of, which isn't the question you've asked, but I'll come back to kind of why it's taken me there. The ultimate reference point for me, whether I can work with somebody or not. Now, they've got lots of reference points, whether they choose to work with me or not, but my ultimate one is, are you a learner? And if the person who I'm working with is not a learner and open to learning and being in I will use the notion of a way of being that is a learning way of being.
Yep.
Pete, I don't think I've got anything in my tool bag that can really help a person who's not open to learning.
I'll give you a frame that I would use in that circumstance, but I'm also interested in, how do you probe that? Because I'm going to make a big assumption here that most of the people we're spoken to are probably, they've got some background, whether it's privileged or not, whether it's education or not, it almost doesn't matter. If you ask, most of us will be working with adults, do you like to learn? Yes is the answer. Are you a learner? Yes is the answer. Do you like to learn? Yeah. I'm going to guess that most of the answers would be in the affirmative. Of course, I love to learn, Connie. Yeah, of course, I'm going to do this. How do you probe to find out how serious they are? Because you and I both know it's so easy to say it, and actually bloody hard to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes from the distinction of what is being a learner. And was I a learner at school? Absolutely not. Was I a learner at university? Absolutely not. And was I a learner through most of my career? I would say absolutely not. Now, did I learn heaps? Absolutely. Was I of a way of being that was a learner? To be the joy of learning and the joy of finding out for no real, I'm just catching my words here, but I'm going to go with it, for no overall purpose other than to be a learner. I learned for an outcome. I learned for an outcome, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, so you should, but I think there's a much bigger as well as. So, this is where the notion of being curious comes in, maybe I could ask, are you curious? But again, when I've asked that question before, people think, oh, I'm curious to learn. It's a two. So there's almost a chicken and egg going on. So people will say a learning mindset. So, that's typically what a lot of people would say. I would, in the work that I do, prefer to see it as a almost a mood, an energy, a way of being that is being a learner and open to learning, almost with no consequences. That there's a different level. There is this notion, you want to take it here, there is a notion of second order learning, which actually gets into the domain of existentialism and actually be an observer of self. I rarely would go there in the notion of an explanation of Yeah, so
Yeah, I
it's
wouldn't. I
inclined
wouldn't.
around second order learning and existentialism, but that's really a lot of what it could come down to is being an observer of self and an open observer, of those around you and the world around you.
I'm playing with this myself, Connor. I'm spitballing a little bit here. If I ask that question, are you a learner? And, obviously if the answer was no, I go, well, we're done here.
Yeah.
Let's assume the answer is yes, I'm a learner. The next question I'd probably ask is, so how do you position yourself as a learner?
Yeah, exactly.
And that almost gets some transderivational search going, what do you mean? Exactly. I don't understand the question.
Exactly.
And that's partly my point. Yes. And then if they're able to answer that question, it's not about actually the answer, it's how they answer the question for me. Right. Then I might go down very binary. So learn what? Because if they're then only interested in learning knowledge, yes, and learning stuff, yeah, then I'm not really, caveat, I'll come back to it, not really that interested. And what I've come across is this distinction between single, double, and triple loop learning. Whereas single loop learning is simply, we did something, we got it right, got it wrong, what can we adjust for next time? Okay. Whereas double loop learning and triple loop, well, double loop is more, I think, what you've said in terms of secondary, where it's whether we got it right or wrong, what did we learn? Yeah. And what can we apply in the next time? So it's a deeper level. Yeah. Triple loop learning is then even deeper, looking at some of the assumptions we make in the first place. Beautiful. And when I've explored that with leaders and groups, it's not, and partly it will be my explanation. It's not as simple or as easy as it could be, but most say they're interested, but either they don't want to, they don't make the time, they've got lower levels of awareness, they're too busy focusing on the surface level stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And you've put it far more eloquently than I was able to. And I'm certainly going to do some research and tip you up after this around triple loop learning, because what I think I failed to do effectively was the notion of, I understand it, of first and second order learning is what you've described as first and third.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll send you some stuff.
So I'm very interested to learn more about that without it just being stuff.
There you go. And then, so let me throw the caveat in.
Sure.
It's amazing when you move out on your own. The most popular question I got asked is, what are you going to call the business? Apart from Pete Clark Associates or Pete Clark Consulting, or, I wasn't going to go, I didn't want to make it about me, although, as you might have heard in the previous podcast with Karen, I am the business, which is Indeed. A challenge in and of itself. Indeed. So I came up with 21 Whispers for the reason that I believe life whispers to us. Yeah. But we only tend to do something when it shouts. Yeah. Now, the 21 is an arbitrary number. It could be 4, could be 22. It could be 647, no idea. But this metaphorical 21st whisper is when somebody does something based on something I do or say or how I'm being. And that there's a story behind that of an actual event that, creates goosebumps in me, because this woman came up to me and said, "You've changed my life." And it was great at the time. On reflection, now I understand, I just happened to be lucky enough to be the 21st whisper. Because on many occasions, I guarantee I've been the 20th. Yeah. Or the first. Yeah. Right. So, and I'll never hear and should never hear of the impact I've had, because that's led them to go and seek out Conor. And Conor does some coaching with them. Conor says something, "Oh my God, Conor, you've changed my life." Yeah. Now, what I've reconciled over the years is not all day, every day, because it doesn't pay the bills. But more and more, I'm really comfortable being the 3rd whisper, or the 8th whisper, or the 20th whisper, because I'm still contributing with an intent to take you to the next door or the next place that will allow someone else to help you see your way of being and your way of doing differently. And it's actually, for me over the years, it's helped me be okay with not getting the best results externally all the time, because that's not perhaps why I'm there for that person. So coming back to your question about how do you position yourself as a learner, are you a learner? Yeah. I might be in certain situations really provocative. And, I'm saying this very carefully, piss them off a little bit,
Yeah.
Because I know that they'll lead them to go somewhere else to potentially hear the 21st whisper from somewhere else.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, not every coach is appropriate for every person. And any coach who thinks that they are, and in fairness, I don't think many coaches think that they are right for every person. It's about a fit and a match. So my response, if your 21st whisper, is the CEO's caddy. So for me, the metaphor I use, and was again conferred upon me by a friend actually as we were playing golf, he said, "Mate," said, you're like the CEO's caddy. And I went, that's it. That's exactly what I feel that I do. And for me, the notion is I walk alongside my clients. And I know, you're a golfer too, but anybody who's listening to this and you watch, the recent PGA Championship, if you like, you see the caddies, they're there, they're walking alongside, they're having conversations, they're being truly present with their golfing partner, the player, and then they step away. So, the notion of taking the action, and actually, for any golfer listening, if you don't like anything else said other than observe, choose, act, well, observe, choose, act works on the golf course. Observe yourself, observe the ground, observe the lie of the land, the choice, what club am I going to take, and the action that you take. So for me, the metaphor of walking alongside my clients is something that, resonates with me. So hence, my brand, if you like, from a business perspective, is the CEO's caddy.
Yeah, I like it. Conor, I know that you have written a book, which is great. I think there's a book in all of us, and mine's just sitting on the shelf still, 30,000 words of draft that I was going to pick up February 2020, but then COVID hit, so I will get there. But I'm interested. It's called Trust, and it's essentially about, well, why don't you tell the listeners what's the essence of it about? Because I want to ask a couple of questions about the main premise.
No worries. The main premise is that trust, which is actually the title of the book, Trust begins and ends with self. Mm-hmm. So that in itself is the direct answer to the main premise. And what I hope I've created through the book is some stories to bring context with regards to, my own personal story and journey that takes to the point to which I've created a model, which I call the new ordering of trust, which leads the reader through, beginning with self, this notion of being and doing, and taking the leader through, in essence, a self journey of trust, then a way that we can build trust in a one-on-one relationship, then a way that we can build trust with our team. And I do then go into this notion, because I do believe leadership is changing, about how we can be a more effective leader in and of society. And then very briefly, my goodness, I go into this space of what I call universal energy. It might be spirituality, might be religion, I hope this isn't glib. I don't really care what it is for the person who reads it, hence this notion of universal energy. Is there something bigger than all of us, which ultimately outstrips the ego, possibly even outstrips legacy? And I feel that if we can feel that energy, that somewhere within us, then here's the irony, it kind of comes back to self, because we're feeling it within ourselves.
Conor, tell me your views on why. So the question, we should trust ourselves. It starts and ends with ourselves. Why is that such an issue for humans, that they don't trust themselves?
I think so. The external world, the outside in as opposed to the inside out. There are so many external influences on us, especially societal influences. So words like should, words like have to, words like must, those are external words, if that makes sense in this context, because they're arguably societal expectations. And more, you mentioned TikTok and, kind of social media today. And, certainly, we've got older children, 20, for me, nearly 29 and 26-year-old. And I know yours, 18, 22 and 25. But even the youngsters today, the young teenagers today, the external influences are far greater. So I think that is a massive challenge on trusting oneself. Therefore, how do we find a way of understanding self? And then, I guess I feel I'm about to go on a bit of a rant here, but, the education system of today in the West is still typically a Victorian education system that was, in the late Industrial Revolution, and that's still kind of the education today. Now, I had great joy of walking past a primary school last year, and there was this notion of being more self-aware, and there was something, they were talking about whole body listening. That's fantastic. They're starting to bring that into the education system today, being aware of, I would say this, wouldn't I, our way of being, moods, energy, somatics, physiology. Yeah. I dare say in the schools that we went to, we never heard that. We never got it. So no. we're not as typically, here we are, white middle-aged men, but I'll say most in the Western world, we're not educated in this. And if somebody's listening to this from a different culture, from Asia or whatever, then I don't have enough knowledge, but I hope that somewhere in those cultures, there's more of an understanding of kind of way of being. I believe, and certainly for me personally, that's what's helped me understand about trusting myself more. I now got a framework. I mean, does everybody need a framework? I don't know. I found it very, very helpful to have these 3 circles to go, I can go into, what am I telling myself? What am I feeling? Or what's my body telling me? That helped me enormously.
I know you don't mean this, but how would someone therefore make the distinction if they pick up what you say, you're trusting self? How do you make the distinction and help someone see that's not about being arrogant? That's not about being narcissistic. Yeah. How do you help them make that distinction?
Well, so I'll go to the age-old one, which many people, and you might have heard, is the oxygen mask. So, the flight attendant, says, what do you do first when the oxygen mask comes down? Put it on yourself so you can help others. So that's one. And I also have this little thing I've created out of a coaching session a few years ago. And if anybody has a pen and a pencil, if you write a little s, and then capital ELFISH, little s, it's okay to be a little bit selfish. So I think we have to kind of take that notion that to be our best self, we have to acknowledge, understand self, be a little bit selfish to then be of service to others.
Conor, I'm really conscious of time, and I'm really grateful for your transparency and insight. I'm going to close, if it's okay, with a few quick fire questions. You don't know these are coming, so we'll go with these. So are you more sunset or sunrise?
Oh, sunrise. I'm a 5 o'clock in the morning person, not a 6 o'clock in the evening person. That's okay, done, next.
Right. You said you were a Scot with an Irish name and an English accent living in Aussie. So at the World Cup, who do you support?
Which World Cup?
Any World Cup.
Well, so there's an interesting one. So the Rugby World Cup, Rugby Union World Cup, that is Scotland, right, without a doubt. At the Soccer World Cup, it's been a long time since Ali's Army ever made it to the Soccer World Cup, so therefore I might just support the English in a Soccer World Cup.
Right. Okay. What's a rule that you like to break?
Rule that I like to break. A rule that I like to break. What is emerging for me? I'm going to my body here physiologically. What's a rule that I like to break? I'm not sure I've got an answer for that. I really don't. Okay. Nothing's emerging, to be honest.
What about the opposite? What's a maxim you like to live by?
Asking myself how the mood that I'm in or the language that I'm using is serving me. So it's so turning it into a question is how is what I'm feeling, how is what I'm thinking serving me?
Okay. And then finally, what's one of the books or quotes that's changed your life?
I'll answer both of them, mate. So the book, undeniably, that's changed my life is Coaching to the Human Soul by Alan Sealer, who's the, arguably one of the world leaders of ontological coaching. And he's written four editions of, there's four editions as a sequence, but in whole, Coaching to the Human Soul by Alan Sealer. And from a quote perspective, Alan Watts, who's kind of a philosopher, who said, waking up to who you are requires letting go of who you imagine yourself to be. And that does
Mic
resonate.
drop moment there, I think. I think that's a perfect way to pause, certainly our public conversation, Conor. Thank you so much. One, for your time, two, for your insights, and I look forward to continuing our conversations privately.
Pete, thanks very much indeed, and privileged to be on your podcast. Thank you.
You're welcome.